Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this interesting waterfront seminar on improving air quality and reducing carbon emissions at ports. And welcome. And unlike the usual events Waterfront put on, which I'm participating in, I don't need to ask you to be quiet or to take your seats. But in this new era, I hope you're ready and with notepads prepared, because we've got three interesting presentations. Actually, I'm adding a few slides as well, so there'll be four presentations this morning. There will be an opportunity to table some questions using the chat box, which should be towards the bottom of your screen. So please do fire in some questions, and we will have the presentations first and then come back to some Q&A afterwards, and we'll be finishing promptly at 11 o'clock. So not too long this morning. Interested to see what your views are and feedback is on this very relevant topic. I would say as we move out of the lockdown, an observation we've made with some of the speakers is how air quality has actually improved across the UK with the lockdown. Obviously that's a sort of short-term blip, we hope, in terms of the actual lockdown, but how do we sustain that? How do we make sure that air quality continues? Air quality is at a good level moving forward. The ports industry has faced varying amounts of interest and indeed criticism in some places across the world, and the UK is not immune to that. And we've seen certain ports, particularly in proximity to big dense populations and areas such as cities and towns, etc., where political pressures and environmental pressures have been raised through stakeholders and local authorities and others. There is a challenge, obviously, for ports, as you probably know, that a lot of the air quality impacts stem from port users and others who the ports don't have direct control or influence over. So it's a bit of a challenge for how we work forward. We're going to have three slightly different presentations, and then I'll add a few slides at the end on a report BPA has just produced on Shoreside Power. We're going to kick off first of all with my colleague Tim Morris, who is Chief Executive of the UK Major Ports Group, who's going to give a policy overview and share his thoughts as to the background. And over to you, Tim. You've got about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'll try not to use all of that. So I'm Chief Executive of something called the UK Major Ports Group, which is a trade association for large port operators in the UK. If I could move the slides along. There you go. Here we go. So I'm going to set a sort of overall context and then let my fellow speakers dive into some of the more interesting detail. The first bit of context I'm going to set is that the UK government has set out an ambitious agenda for not just air quality reduction, but emissions improvement more generally. And maritime is an integral part of that. There's some debate about how it's counted within the numbers, but the government has come forward with something called the Clean Maritime Plan, which sets actually a more ambitious trajectory for improvement than the international standards for maritime air quality and emissions improvement. Now, this was produced last year, but it still remains very much a core part of the government's policy agenda. And indeed, for those of you who'd gone through the Committee for Climate Change annual report to Parliament that was produced recently, you will have seen that the Clean Maritime Plan is referenced very clearly as one of the key mechanisms that the Committee for Climate Change see on addressing emissions and air quality as a side product of that in terms of the UK's overall improvement trajectory. But I think we like to start with a bit of context about why it's important to think about maritime properly, and that's because if you care about emissions, if you care about sustainability, then you should be moving freight by water. These are not my stats. They're not trade association stats. These are the government stats on emissions intensity. So how much CO2 is produced per ton per kilometre. And as you can see there, the shipping categories are down at the bottom in terms of how much carbon they produce per ton per kilometre. Obviously, massively less than air, but also but significantly less than moving things by road as well. So, maritime starts from, being part of the solution, but we're not complacent about that. And it's important that we take our own steps to, keep putting our house in order to get to that net zero intensity point that we want to get to. Some people ask me, why are we bothering doing with this? We've got a pandemic, we've got Brexit coming down the line. What is it? Do we not have enough to think about? And the answer is probably not, or certainly not actually in terms of most of the port operators. COVID-19 is producing a sort of sense of accelerated evolution in a number of different ways. So the way we use technology, and here we are, participating in an online version of a conference that demonstrates it. And that's just as important for sustainability as it is for anything else. The imperative for change is still there in terms of the science, but also increasingly in terms of the ports, but their wider stakeholder groups as well, both in civil society, but also people like investors as well, continually asking questions about what we are doing to improve our sustainability performance. And the government has come forward with its ideas about a green transport revolution, announcing a £2 billion fund for cycling, electric scooters and walking. Just a very small fraction of that would actually significantly support decarbonisation of a lot of stuff that we just take for granted in terms of essential goods every day. One of the complicated things that we face, as maritime as a whole and ports to a certain degree, is that the future is even more unknowable in low emissions terms than in general. So here are two maps or graphs of what the future fuel mix for maritime would be. One's taken from a university, one's taken from a firm of consultants. They're both recognised, specialists in this area, and I'm not making a case for either graph, but I would just point out that on the left-hand one, as you look at it, the large blue area as we get towards 2050 is ammonia, NH3, whereas on the right-hand side it's a sort of muddy brown element on the right. So you can see there's some very dramatic differences in the headlines of what the future might look like. So that's an uncertainty that's really important but difficult to work through. In terms of ports themselves, electrification is probably one of the no-lose moves that we need to keep working on, and indeed there are significant examples of electrification of port operations themselves, and there's some pictures on the left-hand side there. I'm going to leave the top left-hand one of the pilot boat for Tanya to talk about, but one of the important things that we need to bear in mind is that it's a different world. It's a step change difference in the amount of electricity required and the infrastructure and capacity around it to move from charging equipment and relatively small vessels up to the large freight carrying vessels that we've seen on previous pictures. There are some important things to barriers to confront, first of which is around operational constraints. There are some limits to what fully electric kit, like the type you can see on the bottom left-hand side, can do, how often it needs to be charged, what the sort of efficiency penalties of that are. Demand is uncertain. The cost for actually putting in the infrastructure, especially if you have to reinforce network grids outside the gate, are significant. And the UK electricity market is a complex beast, both in terms of its regulation, but also in terms of its charging. It's electricity in the UK for industrial users significantly more expensive than it is, for example, elsewhere in Europe. But change is happening, and change is happening quite quickly and quite significantly as well. And whilst it's fashionable to talk about ammonia or shoreside power, etc., there are some really important operational things and efficiency gains that you can make that are being made in ports around the world, the UK, that drive significantly better air quality. We'll talk about Caroline will talk about how technology is a key enabler to this, but just point out this example from Southampton, where 1 year on from introducing a package of different measures, they've already seen that their NOx levels reducing in terms of concentration to below the UK national objective levels. So it's not very sexy stuff, it's really important, and it drives significant improvement. The last thing I'm going to talk about, just touch on, is the fact that there needs to be a further step change to get us from that significantly increasing the efficiency of the emissions to getting to a net zero point. The government has announced as part of its Clean Maritime Plan this idea of pilot clusters around the UK. Now that's not gone as quickly in government terms as we'd like, given the changing, the different priorities that have come up over the last 12 months. But we expect to see some movement on this very soon. The key thing about this is going to be money, and Richard's going to talk about money and green funding later on, and that's something where we're completely on the same page as. In order to make these kind of changes, the big step changes, and make those changes faster, we need to work with industry and government need to work together, and government needs to back up some of its rhetoric about green power and green transition with some support for freight sectors that underpin all of our everyday lives. And with that, Richard, I'll hand over to somebody else. I think you're on mute, Richard.
Apologies, there we go. First mistake by the chair, there we go. Thank you very much, Tim, excellent as ever. Don't worry, Tim, I've got 3 questions already for you, which are hopefully are not going to be too challenging, but for debate afterwards. But moving swiftly on, and Tim's teed up Tanya Ferry, who's the Head of Environment Policy at the Port of London Authority, to cover what initiatives the PLA have been doing recently. Tanya, over to you. You've got 10 minutes as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And as Richard said, I'm Head Environment at the Port of London Authority. I'm going to take you through our journey to so far to reduce our air quality emissions and get to as net zero as much as is possible at the moment. So just a little introduction to the Port of London and the area that the authority manages. So we run from Teddington out to the estuary. We cover over 20 councils, areas, and as you can see from the slide, there is some very different uses for the river. If I was to put it into emission terms, the slide to the left, or the image to the left, would be much, much smaller because mostly it is man-powered movements in the west of London. In the centre of London, there's a lot of movement around tourism and passenger transport, but also bringing construction and waste in and out of London through the superhighway that the Thames provides instead of on the roads. And then east of the barrier, we get all of our wine, cars, fridges, freezers, you name it, comes through the port, or oil. And as we've seen, there's been some changes in the amount that we've been using recently. And similarly, we're seeing the changes in how the river is used. But it creates quite a challenge because of the sources of the emissions that come across and the 90 miles of bank that the solutions need to be provided within, working with others like the authorities and also the terminal operators. When we started the work on air quality as a whole back in 2016-17, we started looking at how we as the river contributed to the urban area, as Tim and Richard have both alluded to, closer to occupied areas. There's a much higher concern around emissions. But in the context of the wider London area, the river is relatively small. But as you can see, it starts to grow over time and is going to grow even further as decarbonisation is taken on other transport links. And that's true of both NOx and PMs. For some reason the slides aren't moving forward. Let's try that. There we go. Perfect. So we recognise that we need to take action, notwithstanding the way the industry works and the time that vessels are invested and used for. We have vessels that are pre-war in their hull and engines that are several decades old that have been replaced various parts of. A bit like Trigger's broom, they go on for quite a long period of time. They don't necessarily get replaced as a whole in the same way we might think about our cars and road transport. So we decided that we needed to look into that a bit more detail, and we did a Portwide inventory through the 90 miles of river and into London with the London Council on Transport, TfL. And the predictions weren't very positive. If we hadn't done anything, then it's likely that PM and sulphur might increase, and NOx would slowly go with the existing regulators, but not necessarily to the extent we wanted it to. And again, the type of emissions were coming from very different sources and different places in the Thames. So there's very different actions required for each. So working from the left, the top 4 emitters while sailing are container vessels and ro-ro within the port in the lower Thames, and then passenger and tug in London, and then dredgers that move in between the two on the far right. But you can see for some of the others, particularly things like cruise ship, the emissions at berth was greater than those when they were sailing. So there's some very different solutions required to try and reduce those emissions, as an example. So we wrote an air quality strategy and published it in 2018. And within that, based on evidence as to the emissions likely from different sources and in different locations, we set about a list of 18 actions to try and understand and implement improvements over time. So we're halfway through our first 5 years, and we have even added additional actions to take extra steps. So for inland fleet, that's what we term for our tugs and the passenger boats, particularly in London, although they're not exclusively to London. A lot of them are family-run businesses, and they don't have necessarily the time that my team can afford to look at the types of solutions that are available to them. So we've done a lot of work to help them understand the types of solutions that they can take in order to move towards the targets that we've set the port to meet over the next 10 and 30 years. Things like switching fuels, trying to provide shore power in smaller locations is much more possible than it might be on a larger ship, and I'll come to that in a minute. Thinking about how they use their vessels when they go with the tide. Most freight is moved with tide in the Thames, but not always. And then we have taken that a step further in the last 18 months. We've just done a roadmap for the inland vessels to look at what they can do to get to net zero by 2050. And there are some barriers that's identified for us and other authorities like the Maritime Coast Guard Agency as a licensing authority, and we're working to try and reduce those barriers, but it also gives the fleet operators an understanding of where their investment might need to be placed. And we have led by example, as Tim's mentioned. We have a hybrid vessel, we have a hybrid pilot cutter. It's the third hybrid on the river. The second was the vehicle ferries that cross up at Woolwich, and the first was a Belinda ship tug. So we are seeing a shift to newer technologies, and we're starting to see retrofits also coming into to hopefully reduce more emissions. And working with the GLA in London, there's been some funding made available to a number of operators to do so. With shipping, as soon as we introduced the air quality strategy, we introduced a green tariff, which is misnamed really. It's there to incentivise greener ships than legal standards. So if they awarded a score, they get a discount on the charges to use the river that the port levies against the cargoes. And we can use that to understand their performance and their ability to use infrastructure like onshore power. We've also looked at Shoreside Power, as it is, as Tim mentioned, the cool thing to look at. For us, being 95 miles long, it only provides a solution in a very small part of the river at each location. It's not something that necessarily works in a long estuary river as an investment for the bang per buck. But alternative fuels, with the variable solutions that we're seeing and projections, we need to react and provide infrastructure to those ships that might switch to different types of fuels. We've got operators talking about LNG, ammonia and methanol, and we need to work with them to find out where we might be able to provide them with those fuels, given that most of our bunker barges within the port operate only with marine gas oil and low sulphur diesel. But we also need to evidence the work we've done. So we've done quite a lot of monitoring. The centre image shows you the dispersion of the inventory that we had done in 2016. It shows you where the hotspots might be due to the activity of the vessels using their AIS tracks. On the left at the top, there is an exhaust monitoring exercise, which we've been repeating over a number of years to see how different solutions affect the emissions from different types of vessels, given their operational profiles, to see what's the most effective solution. We've got some passive tubes. We've currently got NO2, but we're also expanding to ozone, as well, to see if we can pick up different trends coming forward. And then on the right, you can see a real-time monitor actually at Greenwich, if you can see Cutty-Sark just behind. And this is the results that we get from those. They were put in as a compass rose. The blue bob in the centre, hopefully you can see, is one of our cruise moorings. You can see already that shore power is not in its truest form possible, because the vessel is moored in the centre of the river, but it was a local concern for residents. So we've done a year's monitoring now, and this is 6 months of the cruise season that has been appraised. Largely, there obviously was a difference when cruise ships were there with the emissions, but in most senses there was no exceedances, except for one very calm site. But there was some interesting data around the pier and the use of the river as a whole. So there is definitely needs for some action, and we have put a call for a solution to provide a zero emission berth at Greenwich. We were hoping by 2025, but in reality, now that COVID has taken us a step back when it comes to investment, we will still aim for that target, but as close as we can get it will be a solution. But as I say, we're not looking for something that is just at Greenwich. We want to find something that finds a solution for wider parts of the river. So as we move into our iterative process, halfway through our first 5 years of an air quality strategy, we have, under the Department for Transport guidance, put our update out for consultation, and we've updated our targets to include decarbonisation and reducing further the targets for NOx and PMs over the next 20 to 30 years. That will be evidenced in our inventory, which we will repeat in line with London at 2022, and we will be looking to make sure that it is a just transition and provides the port with a local economic benefit, as well as facilitating port trade and using the low carbon transport that Tim mentioned. So it's not looking at it in isolation, it's making sure that it is a fit solution that makes future proof for the local operators as well. That was all I was going to say. So thank you very much for listening, and hand back over to Richard.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Excellent as ever. It's always interesting to see the journey that the PLA has gone on. And whilst I wouldn't say other ports aren't doing as much on air quality issues, I think PLA is probably one of the leaders, and it's a good port for others to follow. Now moving on to our final speaker, aside from my handful of slides. Caroline Price is the Director of Green Ports at Royal Haskoning. So great job title, Caroline. Looking forward to what you're going to say. Over to you, 10 minutes if possible, please.
Thanks, Richard, and morning all. I'm going to say a little bit specifically around the use of technology in ports as we address this challenge linked to air quality, but also the broader emissions piece that we're all looking at. But we were fortunate enough to do a piece of work with Tim and his team towards the back end of last year, looking at what was going on in the world in terms of the technology opportunities and how they might be applicable within the UK context. A couple of points to just bring forward as we kind of launch into this section of the webinar, which has been touched on by particularly Tanya, but also Tim, which is this point that all ports are unique. So whilst there might be a plethora of options out there for us to think about, not all of them are going to suit all port situations. And partly this is to do with the point that Tanya articulated so very well, which is that ports are often areas where multiple organisations come together, and there are a number of complex networks and relationships that operate within the port estate boundaries, and that there are also different targets and obligations that these bodies might have in terms of air quality, but also other areas of their performance that they need to think about. So that's particularly ports and shipping and the logistics chain piece. And finally, it's important to recognise that as a sector, ports are competitive, and therefore when they're looking to make investment decisions that are potentially beyond a business planning cycle, that can be quite challenging. And some of the technology options that I'll talk about today often have a return on investment that extends beyond that business planning cycle. So the first thing I wanted to do was just quickly say, when I say technology, what do I mean? So there's the big kind of obvious things such as shore power, but also increasingly we're seeing the role of data-driven decision making in terms of our technology piece, and the role of data and how they can inform the digital tools that we can use of really providing insights. And these are the things that we see increasingly driving change for the sector. And these can have benefits not just from an environmental point of view, but also from an operational and economic perspective, particularly when you're looking at things around optimization of your landside and your marine operations. Key to understanding what options are going to work for you, and indeed what options you might be looking at bringing in, is to understand what is your baseline. So Tanya described very well how they've established the baseline for the PLA. And key to that is understanding where's your boundary, how wide an area are you going to consider from an emissions perspective, and therefore what does your baseline look like, and where can you really look to effectuate change. Some things you can control and some things you can't control, and some things you can potentially influence and others you really can't. And understanding the spread across those different scenarios is really important to identifying opportunities that can deliver long-term change. Tanya's already talked extremely well about the role of sensor technology in establishing that baseline and enabling you to monitor against performance indicators. So I won't go into that anymore. The other thing that this slide is showing is just the way that we sort of divided up the port in terms of thinking about technology solutions. From left to right, we're looking at the port estate, the hinterland area, and then the marine aspects of port operations. This final box down the bottom is giving reference to the corporate and commercial role that ports can play, and this is much more talking to the influencing side of things, which is things like the green tariffs that Tanya explained, which is where ports can make certain framework and policy decisions that can help influence decisions taken by their customers or their tenants. So looking at the port estate, this is primarily what we call our landside operations. For most ports, this is the largest source of emissions, and it sometimes primarily comes from their diesel powered plant, cargo handling and storage areas. So there are a number of technology options here that are linked to operational efficiency, which can really drive down your emissions. I've just chosen a couple of those to talk about. Alternative fuels and electrification has been touched on by others, and linked to that is the use of electrical storage systems. But one of the things I particularly want to talk about was the software and data analytics aspect of it, which is where you can bring in some really funky bits of software and technology to drive your operations in really the most efficient manner. And that could be looking at asset management across the board, but also some specific terminal optimization software. So that's things like yard optimization and job optimization software, where it can identify, like particularly thinking within a container stack, for example, this can have a piece of kit that works out what is the optimum number of maneuvers that can be involved to kind of make sure that your container is placed in really the most ideal position within the stack to minimize the future number of movements that you might need to make in terms of bringing it back onto a vessel. And also connected to that, you can have something called job optimization software, which is where those two linked bits of programming can work out which bit of kit within your yard is best placed to make that maneuver. So which crane or which forklift is in a position such that in order to move that container, it requires the least number of movements. So you can see that that's going to drive your operations in terms of efficiency, but associated to that, you'll be driving down emissions because you're purely going to have vehicles and plant moving around as little as possible. On the hinterland side, and this can be something where ports can sometimes have limited control, but perhaps a large influence, and emissions from road haulage can account for up to 15% of the total emissions. So you can see the role that alternative fuels and electrification can particularly have in terms of addressing this. And certainly in areas like London, the Mayor and others have brought in some significant policies to help deliver that. But similarly, digital tools have a role to play here in a similar manner. And I'll talk about them a little bit, but I wanted to also mention these potential longer term solutions. And these are not necessarily driven by technology, but technology has a role within them. And that's things like modal shift opportunities, where you're taking some of your hinterland movements off of the road and onto rail, or perhaps coastal shipping. And then in perhaps a longer term solution is this redirecting operations sort of outside of urban centres. And we see this elsewhere around the globe. Particularly in countries where they have perhaps more capacity close to their ports, where they're shifting some of their storage areas and their handling operation areas outside of the urban centres where the berthing for the vessels actually takes place. So touching on some of these software options and the data and the digital tools that we can help in terms of the hinterland management. And these are things like vehicle booking systems and route optimization software. So vehicle booking systems are usually web-based, and we sometimes call them truck appointment systems. It's basically a real-time appointment system that can be used by hauliers to select a time for pickup or delivery of a container. And lots of people are quite used to using these on their apps with respect to things like deliveries that you might have from DHL or whatever it might be. But these have kind of, it's similar to that concept, but kind of scaled up to really manage the way that trucks are coming in and out of the port. And it can also be used to manage barge and train arrivals if you're a port where you have sort of multiple hinterland access routes coming in and out. So the Port of Rotterdam, for example, has various applications that they use to improve the efficiency and relieve their hinterland congestion. It's worth saying that these systems are well used already throughout the UK. DP World London Gateway, PD Ports, Forth Ports and Peel Ports all already utilise these, and they seem to be incredibly effective. This can really help in terms of particularly reducing the number of empty truck movements that we sometimes see linked to ports. This picture at the bottom here is the Forth Ports mobile VBS app, which I just included as an example. They originally had it just for their containers, but they've now extended the functionality to accommodate their general cargo. Route optimization software is just a slightly different version of this, I suppose, which is where it's more about understanding what the routes are like coming into and out of the port, and the port might not be able to influence how the trucks use these particular routes coming in and out, but you know your local area extremely well. You know the pinch points, you know where there's going to be congestion, you know the worst times of day. So all of that information could be fed into some route optimization software that you can then use to help your hauliers to perhaps time their arrivals and work around some of the congestion points within your local area. This picture on the right is the Hutch support system, which is called Paris. And it's just an example of a transport planning system where lots of features come into play in terms of understanding the route planning and the intermodal pathways, etc. And then if you have something called a port community system, this is where basically all of those bits of software come together and talk to each other. And if you kind of bring them all together into this overarching system, it just allows you to understand the interfaces between all of your various activities that are going across all of your assets and the elements of your port operations. And that can really allow you to drive optimization from a central point. Finally, on the marine side, as Tanya's already said, the vast majority of emissions in ports are derived from visiting vessels. And again, whilst there is a relationship between ports and the shipping lines, the decisions that can be taken around driving emissions can sometimes be more around influence than control. But there are digital tools can have a role here also, again, around optimizing movements and performance. I'm not going to talk about shore power particularly because I know that Richard is going to pick that up shortly, but I had to include it here because it's the, obviously, as you say, the big opportunity that everybody's talking about right now around the marine piece. So we look at floating plant. This is an interesting area for ports, and it's often an area where some of the highest emissions, again, can be linked to this floating plant, and that's primarily due to the variety of plant that are involved, but also the differences that exist between the different bits of plant, and perhaps that makes some challenges in terms of retrofitting or upgrading as ports are thinking about their strategy going forward. Tanya's already talked about the hybrid vessel that they have, the hybrid pirate vessel they have. This just another couple of examples from elsewhere in the world. This is a shore power picture from the States, and then I wanted to pick up on this bottom picture here because it's just a slightly different way of thinking about this alternative power, and this is sort of a floating power source. So this is a power barge from Hamburg, which they have floating around. So that instead of vessels having to come onto berth, what this barge does is it can go around and attach particularly to cruise vessels and enable them to power up without needing to come alongside. This is an LNG power barge, and it supplies primarily cruise ships in the summer, but it also operates as a sort of just a general power plant through the winter and can also provide heat. The other thing that I wanted to mention was this shore-based pilotage. So this was something that a few years ago was really, really novel, and it's one of the particular examples that have been accelerated through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen increasingly operators, particularly within the LNG field, embracing this remote pilotage technique, and it's primarily been driven by the difficulty of being able to get on board because of the difficulties with social distancing within a vessel situation. So this is an example of where technology was designed for one reason and perhaps has been accelerated for another, but we can really see the benefits in terms of the emissions point of view going forward. So just to wrap up then, it's clear to see that there are some common themes that exist across all of these areas within the port. Data is clearly king and is going to be increasingly so going forward, and technology is continually evolving. Now that can be an opportunity but also a challenge in terms of making investment decisions for any port in any given scenario. It's clear that community systems deliver multiple benefits, but that goes along with a higher price tag. And collaboration is key. So technology is going to be part of your tools and part of your solutions, but you absolutely continue to need people, and people need to work together both within the Port Estate, but also with more strategic partners, such as the relationship that Tanya described between the Port of London Authority and the Mayor, etc. And then my final point is just around saying, although all of this conversation has been primarily focused around air quality and emissions, it's clear that all of these tools can have a potential benefit beyond that. And in embracing digital technology, there is all sorts of operational optimization that can be taken forward that can deliver sustainable operations, economic improvement, as well as environmental performance improvement generally to help with us on our journey to decarbonisation. And that's me. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Caroline. Excellent, very interesting thoughts there, and we'll come back with some questions for Caroline shortly. I'm having some slight issues with my internet connection, so I'm going to gloss through my slides, but I'll turn my webcam off to improve, hopefully, the delivery. I've got a few slides, so if I can just ask the audience to go to the first. Got the first one. Rebecca, can you? I'm going to cover Shoreside Power. So I think that's better now. Sorry about that. That's my internet connection. Occupational hazard for these events. Anyway, and thank you, Rebecca, for clicking onto the first slide. I'm going to quickly cover a few thoughts on Shoreside Power. I'm not going to dwell too long on this, though, because we've got time for Q&A. So if you want to get any questions ready, the organisers will filter those through to us, and the panellists can answer those. Just quickly, this slide covers what shore power is. Effectively, I'm sure a lot of you will know about this, but plugging in ships while they're at berth, so they don't have to run their generators, can reduce the emissions from their engines, etc. We produced a report, and we did this internally, but with the help of those suppliers on the right. And effectively, this report is available on our website. We published this last month, and two of my colleagues wrote it. And what this, just the headline point from this though, while shore power is an exciting policy development and area and an operational solution potentially, BPA is technology neutral. We commissioned this research and report based on the fact that there was a lot of interest from both government and varying levels of interest from port users, some non-existent, others very keen to push forward on this. So we did some analysis of what the barriers and what what possible solutions may be needed to get shore power rolled out further in the UK. But I would say, as it says in the third bullet, we're technology neutral, so we're not suggesting this is the only solution, but it may be one of them. On to the next slide, please. Thank you. The primary barriers we found were around costs, as I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with. Installing these connections can be very costly and require infrastructure and grid upgrades. And quite often it's a sort of combination of port capital investment required, but also wider power networks, local authorities, government departments would have to chip in here. And that is not necessarily something that is always understood by those pushing for shore power. Price of electricity is another area which is seen as a barrier, as well as the point I alluded to on demand and interest from port users, which we think will come eventually, but perhaps we're not quite ready yet. Over to the final slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. So the report, although it explores a lot of those barriers, it does come up with some suggested recommendations. We're not wedded to all of these, but we're floating them for debate, really. The first there is a Green Maritime Fund, and we've called for this in the light of coronavirus, but also I think we were sort of getting towards the situation with the context that shore power could be so expensive to install at certain areas. Now, one thing I didn't say earlier, which I should have said actually, is that shore power is not completely new to the UK. We do have a lot of smaller ports, particularly, and also ports with recreation and fishing activities where those vessels can plug in. Indeed, some of the larger port operations are now also investing in this. But we're still, for the commercial and cargo operations, it's still relatively early stages, etc. But around the globe, we have seen that, and this part of this analysis has found that it's very rare that you get shoreside power provision without some form of public investment. And this is something I think that government is now starting to understand, and this report very much highlights that. So a Green Maritime Fund may be something government could look to. I mean, a lot of people may say, well, government's effectively spending all its money on coronavirus support at the moment, but as a way to get out of the lockdown and recover for the maritime sector and reach our green aspirations, which the government still has, this may be one solution they might want to look at. The second point is a relatively straightforward one, we think, notwithstanding what the loss of revenue for the Treasury here, but removing the tax on electricity as a marine fuel, which is something that definitely can be looked at by government. And then the final one there, having a zero berthing standard would be something that we're open to consideration for. We set out quite an ambitious idea on this to our membership, and we debated this internally with large operators, small operators across the board, and what we've decided to do based on interaction is to have a debate about this instead of us firmly calling for it. But effectively what this could involve is requiring ships in a longer period of time, so not sort of tomorrow, to plug in whilst they're at berth, and if they don't, those ships would have to pay a levy, and effectively that would potentially could drive the demand. Now the levy then could go into, for example, the Green Maritime Fund, and that fund could be used to for ports and others to bid, and ships indeed to bid for support, so they become more compatible with shore power. So that's the kind of the report in a nutshell. It is available on our website. I'm sure you can get hold of it. And we're now going to move over, Caroline Waterfront, thank you, to the Q&A session. I haven't seen a huge amount of questions coming in, so please do fire some more in if you can. I'll see whether my webcam works. Looks like it is. And the first question I had, Tim, I just think, can you perhaps, it was an excellent presentation, just in light of what you were saying in the coronavirus situation and things like the government's aspirations to have air quality plans for the UK ports industry, have things really stalled? Have we sort of slowed right down, or do you think things like the air quality plans, will they come online shortly? Will we be back to normal quite quickly?
So the air quality, the requirement for air quality plans has been pushed back slightly through to the end of the calendar year. It simply became impossible for ports to actually develop the plans in a meaningful way in the original time horizon. And just to give one specific example, in order to have a proper port air quality plan, you need to engage with your haulier community. And the haulier community over the last couple of months, 2 or 3 months, has either been furloughed or unbelievably busy, depending on which part of the market that they work in. So we need that additional bit of time. But what certainly hasn't changed is the acknowledged need for change on the broader emissions perspective. And indeed, we're all, as I said, we're all working in ways now that enable technology in a different way than perhaps we thought was possible within a much shorter time frame. So some of the points that Caroline made, and indeed you already saw being deployed in Tanya's work, we'd probably see some kind of acceleration of that. So whilst there might be a short-term hiatus or slowdown, what you might see is a faster turnout from the end of the year onwards.
Thanks, Tim. And Tanya, you talked a bit about what the PLA has done in terms of its inventory assessment and what it's responsible for. How would you talk to your stakeholders, and how do you kind of overcome the fact that a lot of the emissions that are produced in and around the Thames are not actually under the control of the Thames? So you've obviously got your green incentives there, but how the point about and also, would they understand the fact that, would they differentiate between a lot of the stuff that ends up in lorries is actually potentially being shipped in on vessels coming through the PLA? So a bit of a kind of open question there, Tanya, but perhaps you can try and cover that off.
Yeah, so I think we've been very clear with the stakeholders that are concerned about emissions that the PLA is taking a role that is encouraging and influence rather than able to act in many cases. The benefit that we bring to London in having the Thames used for freight is recognised by the authorities, and the Greater London Authority itself has been working with us on the safeguarded wharf policy to keep wharves open to allow that to continue. So I think it's recognised that that is beneficial for the overall air quality rather than sectorising it into the port itself. I think when it comes to those operators that are the ones with the emissions on the vessels and things, a lot of it is about our open conversation about what is possible, what is preventing them making those changes. And notwithstanding the 95 miles being very diverse, a lot of it is about the power provision that they will need on those sites, and making sure that that has a positive impact and doesn't create an impact somewhere else, literally downstream in the sense of the river or in the sense of the power provision. So a lot of it is about influencing and bringing everyone to the same understanding in both cases, both the operators and the stakeholders.
And Carol, thank you, Tanya. And Caroline, one final one from me before we have a couple from the floor, or the virtual floor, so to speak, is Tanya mentioned green tariffs, but I wonder how common is that around the globe, and what's the experience like?
Yeah, so it's an area that is increasingly common actually, and this is largely around this point that although ports potentially can't control some of these things, there's quite a lot of pressure on them to be demonstrably influencing or seeking to influence where they can emissions beyond the port gate. So we have some of them in the UK. Southampton has them, and also obviously the PLA and others, and they seem to be generally quite successful, and particularly in other places around the globe, they are connecting up with, or they have these very strong working relationships with the supply logistics chain to try and make sure that as they're bringing in these tariffs and bringing in these sort of policy structural changes, they are designed to effectuate the most change, but also preserve those relationships and those networks that are obviously incredibly important to make sure that the operations continue.
Thank you. Tim, I've got a question here. Doesn't say who it's from, but what support do ports need to enable greater modal shift to rail freight? In your presentation, you had some statistics there on rail freight, obviously. Do you want to try and cover that one?
Yeah, very quickly. Modal shift is one of the really important sort of near-term opportunities for improving air quality around ports. Indeed, in urban areas, in general, surface transport is by far the largest contribution to excess, harmful emissions. So more freight on trains is a good idea. More freight actually on water is a good idea as well. Some of the practical things that could happen are, number one, using some of the flexibility that we've seen emerge in the rail system during the COVID-19 crisis, in order to increase the number of freight paths, but also increase the flexibility of utilising those freight paths. Plus, there is something called a modal shift revenue support scheme, which aims to level up the costs between rail and road transport. So, aim for a relatively modest amount of money, you get that nudge effect that pushes the decisions from freight owners about which kind of freight mode they use in favour of the lower carbon, lower emissions freight types like rail freight. So, more action on that. Relatively small targeted amounts of money help unlock quite a lot of improvement.
Thanks. I've had to turn my webcam off not because I've got lots of people running around me, but it's more my internet connection. Apologies about that. So quickly, one for Tanya, because I know Tanya's got to run off shortly, is does the PLA have any plans to incentivise the use of scrubbers on the local small craft, i.e. the Thames Clipper?
So the scheme at the moment in the retrofit I mentioned in the presentation, the GLA and the PLA have done a small scale, £500,000 has been put to one side from the GLA to invest in scrubbers. I think in some cases it's quite challenging to install, so incentivising a retrofit over a new technology entirely that would completely reduce the emissions much more for future is something we still need to look at, whether it's a direction of travel we want to encourage operators to invest in a small step versus the longer term gain.
Thank you. And Caroline, I've got perhaps the penultimate one for you. Have you got any thoughts on ammonia fuel for the potential impacts? I'm not sure if you can cover that. I know Tim knows a little bit about it, or he may know more than I think, but Caroline, perhaps you might share some thoughts, and Tim, you might have a think as well.
Yeah, so there are a number of alternative fuels that are around, I guess, the hydrogen piece that are particularly becoming getting an increasing amount of attention. And this is the ammonia option is kind of closest, if you like, to LNG, and that is kind of, you can transport it in a liquid form. It's a nascent area of technology. I know it's being used increasingly across the globe, and we're looking at it from both a sort of small scale and then sort of larger scale import-export hub sort of style strategies and feasibility studies are being looked at in other areas. It's something that has, its own element of challenge, but also it's seen as being particularly an opportunity in terms of the alternative fuel mix going forward. If you remember those charts that Tim put up early on in his presentation, it's clearly an area where a lot of the industry feels comfortable, and which is perhaps less case for some of the newer hydrogen technologies that are emerging. So I think it's something that's we're going to see as part of the transition mix, particularly over the next few years. Tim, I wonder if you wanted to say anything, particularly as you'd picked it up in the graphs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's certainly part of the mix, but we have a number of different, technology pathways in terms of future fuel, zero emissions fuel. It's not clear yet, where we are on the whole VHS versus Betamax for the older participants in this virtual roundtable, in terms of the choice there, which will win out, and that makes it quite challenging for the port operator, because some of these come with some very significant infrastructure requirements in terms of future bunkering and handling of vessels as well. So jury's still out on which one will be the winner, but we need to get some clarification on that relatively quickly, so the appropriate infrastructure can be in place to service whatever the right pathway ends up being.
Well, thank you very much there to speakers. I had one final question for Tanya, but I know she's got to get off, and actually we've reached time. So can I ask you to give a virtual round of applause to our speakers? That was excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers. They will be circulating the slides from these presentations shortly, so if you want to look at more detail, they'll have information and contacts in that. So thank you very much for now, and goodbye.